Good afternoon, everyone. Today is August 22nd, 2023. This is a Prescott City Council study session. We'll start with a roll call, please.
Mayor Good.
Present.
Mayor Pro Tem Montoya.
Here.
Councilwoman Kentelme.
Here.
Councilman Moore.
Here.
Councilmember Rusing.
Here.
Councilman Sishka.
Here.
And Councilman Tenney.
Yes, ma'am.
All are present.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We have one item on our agenda today. It's a presentation and discussion regarding proposed amendments to the replacement of the following city ordinances. Prescott City Code 5-9-1 through 5-9-6, also Section 5-1-3, and Section 5-10-2. And these are regarding our camping ordinance in the first reference code, curfew on the second reference code, and solicitation on the last reference code. So we do have a number of public comment forms have been presented. So first we'll go over the details of the proposed amendment changes, and then we'll take some public comment on those.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Council. Yes, Joe Young is here today to discuss these three ordinance changes or recommendations for ordinance changes. As you recall, back in, I think it was March, the Council heard on a couple of these items and had directed the staff and Mr. Young to go get some additional public input, which he has been able to do and has come back with some ordinances with some recommendations associated with those ordinances. So I'm going to let Joe walk us through all of these, and so we can have discussion.
So I will add that, we have charter amendments on our general election in November, but I asked the city attorney to review a number of our ordinances within the city that are quite old and haven't been updated to current judicial rulings. So this is just the first of several meetings we'll have on a variety of ordinances. So Joe, if you could please proceed on these three sections.
Thank you. And first we'll discuss the camping ordinance, which is section 5-9. As you'll recall, the original camping ordinance that the city had in place or has in place until now has been rendered unenforceable by subsequent case law. And so essentially case law has said if there is more homeless people in a city than beds, you cannot enforce a camping ban. However, you can establish reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. So given that, we've tried to come up with some reasonable time, manner, and place restrictions while also presenting the police department with the ordinance that's enforceable that they can work with. And in doing so, we try to look at some of the main concerns that people had with camping and so forth, and address those throughout with the time, place, and manner restrictions. Specifically, the idea of encampments or tent cities, people in sidewalks or in places of pedestrian use, and the trash and property cleanup problems that we sometimes deal with. So I brought forward, this is what we discussed in March, is the original ordinance, and I hope you can see it, but you have copies that have been provided. But I have put in this in one document with all of the recommended or alternatives that we have. And so after this document that we have up, we'll go through the recommendations only. But the first thing that we the criticism that we got while we spoke to some of the stakeholders was that a lot of the whereas sections were somewhat demeaning or considered inhumane. And I'll tell you that the whereas is detailing the pit counts in particular got a lot of concern because the pit counts that we used are from 2020. As of now, it's...
And for those of you in the community aren't familiar with that term, that's a point-in-time census of homeless individuals.
Well, thank you, Mayor. That's correct. And so the point in time or the pit counts were done, and they were done countywide. In the Valley and other bigger cities, they're done city by city. But here, it's only done countywide, and their information is fairly old, but it's the best we have at this point. And so putting it in the whereas section becomes a little bit problematic because we know they're dated. We just don't have better information at this point. So the first thing was, the first recommendation, and you'll see it says we recommend removal of italicized sections, was just to cut down a lot on the whereas sections, to remove some of the references towards disease in homeless population, remove the pit count numbers, given that they're outdated, and just to go directly into the time, place, and manner restrictions rather than detail some of that information. So the definitions, we recommend that we keep the original definitions that were in the March version brought before council. We put forth some alternative language that has been used in new ordinances in Portland and other places that have issues and they're trying to deal with it. But I don't think they're the best example to use, and so we've recommended using the original definitions, but not the alternatives. And so getting into the heart of the matter is the recommendations on time, place, and manner restrictions. And that is the route that we recommended we go, although the previous version had essentially a no camping anytime. I think that was still unenforceable given that the pit counts we rely on are old. I think a blanket restriction would get struck down. So the recommendation is this time, place, and manner restrictions, and that is how we recommend setting it up. And here specifically are the time, place, and manner restrictions. So first, the time restrictions would restrict camping anytime between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. So it prevents camping during daytime hours. And the idea behind that, and this has been put forth in some other cities as well, it seems to be working, but it restricts the idea of kind of semi-permanent encampments that sprout up. It restricts that because people have to move or pack up during the day between 8 and 8. So that is the time restriction. The place restrictions or regulations, we have 6 of them. So no camping at any time in the Prescott Downtown Entertainment District, which if you don't know what, I have a map up in a minute we can go over. So no camping at any time in the entertainment district, no camping at any time on sidewalks, trails, rights-of-way streets, alleys, and no camping within 500 feet of a school, or no camping within 500 feet of another camper unless you're part of the same family. And then we also recommend no camping in areas posted no trespassing by the city. So those are the place restrictions. And then we also are recommending manner restrictions as well, which is to say no camping in a way that obstructs property or businesses from being able to use their rights of way. No camping in any way that maintains a fire. So trying to get rid of the potential for dangerousness that comes from a fire or for a gas heater in our campsite. And no ability to erect, install, place, leave, or set up any type of permanent or semi-permanent structure. Those are the kind of pallet houses that you see in some cities. And then continuing on, no prohibition on digging, excavating, or terracing, placing or storing personal belongings in an area greater than 10 square feet, and a restriction on the placing of garbage, trash, or dangerous materials. So those are the time, place, and manner restrictions, which make up essentially the heart of the ordinance. And I'll go to the next suggestion as well, that is camping on private property, which we had some debate about, and I'll tell you most of the feedback we got was did not like restrictions on camping on private property. We did have it allowed if there was written permission. That was under the previous version. But as I mentioned, a lot of people didn't like requiring written permission for someone to be on their own property. We contemplated repealing the section altogether and not dealing with camping on private property and letting that be dealt with in the Land Development Code, which is kind of more the zoning ordinance, and it makes sense there. But ultimately, we drafted this, and I will tell you that some of the feedback that we got from people did not include this. This is a newer section, the recommendation for camping on private property. But it restricts camping on private property to 14-day periods, and no more than 5 14-day periods in any calendar year, with a 30-day time period between those camping periods. So that is the recommendation on private property. And I think it's important that we hear your recommendations or your guidance on that, because there has been a lot of back and forth on the idea of camping on private property and what restrictions we should do. But under our current ordinance, camping in a RV on someone's private property is prohibited, other than the 9-month period after you have a fire or natural disaster. So that is specifically dealt with in the Land Development Code and prohibited, but there is nothing detailing how to treat tent camping or other types of camping on private property. And so whether it's appropriate here or to do so in the Land Development Code, that's what we're looking for, a little bit of guidance from you today. The penalties remain the same. We did get feedback that we should go softer, a civil citation or a diversion on the first offense. But we do have included a warning process to move, and then the misdemeanor if the person does not move. And then finally, the item of discussion that we discussed quite a bit, because a lot of the case law on it, is the idea of what to do with the property that we seize from, for example, Parks and Rec went and cleaned out one of the parks not long ago and had tons of trash that they collected. And so the question of what to do with that when we take that stuff into custody, or if someone's arrested, for example, is what 595 deals with. And so we put forth a couple of different alternatives, but the recommended alternative is that if the property has not been moved after 24 hours, it's deemed abandoned. The city will take custody of that, and anything that's hazardous, bulky, or dangerous, or trash will be disposed of. Everything else will be kept for 14 days with notice given to the person so they can have that 14 days to claim their property. And I think that these elements that we've put in have brought it in conformance with the case law that's been pretty substantial within the Ninth Circuit and addresses most of the major concerns, including the idea of encampments and the idea of tent cities and so forth, and protects the downtown entertainment district where people are more likely to be out late, and it presents more dangers for people camping and for those walking around. So at this point, I know there's comments. I want input from you, and I'm willing to take any questions.
Well, I'll start this discussion off by making the statement that a lot of people in the community weren't aware that we already had a camping ordinance in existence. But our concern was it was not up to date with current case law, and it would be subject to difficulties to enforce and potentially difficult to defend its validity if we were challenged in court. So that was our intention, is to bring this up to date and make sure we could enforce it and it would be defensible under current case law. Councilmember Rusing.
Thank you. I think what the public needs to understand is these ordinances must be defensible, like the mayor said. That means if we get sued by homeless vagrants or the ACLU and we go to court, we have to be able to defend ourselves and not lose. So we have to keep that in the back of our minds. Also, this is a safety issue, public health issue. As you know, our Watson Lake, we're under a mandate from the state Arizona Department of Water Quality because there's large amounts of E. coli, which comes from fecal material, and it's from human fecal material. And we cannot allow people to continue to use our creeks as bathrooms. And my third point is for Mr. Young. I would like to suggest that we also include no camping either by the owner or others on property that has been condemned. There's a condemned property off of Gail Gardner that's been condemned for 6 years. We still haven't done anything about it, and the owner and his vagrant friends are still living there and doing suspicious activities. And I think it's important that we close this loophole and include no camping by anybody on condemned property, whether they're the owner or not. Thank you.
And if I can address a couple of things real quick. You're right about the case law, and I should say just quickly what that means. Basically, it is unconstitutional to criminalize status. That's what the Supreme Court has repeatedly said. And they've said that homelessness is a status, and you cannot criminalize status. You can criminalize actions. And so what that means was kind of up in the air, but through a series of court cases in the Ninth Circuit, which we are bound to, that's where the information came that as long as there's not enough beds for the amount of homeless people you have, and you can prove that there's not enough beds, that you cannot have a blanket ban on camping. And then to your point about the private property, I think the current section or current recommended section has a 14-day limit, and I think it would address condemned properties as well. If we want something more specific to condemned properties that is more covers more situations, we can do that as well, depending on the input here today.
Thank you.
Councilman Tenney.
Thank you, Mayor. Mr. Young, you addressed essentially what my question was. We've made several references to case law, and the City Council's been briefed on that. We've got a lot of things come across our plate, but I think most of us remember the gist of that, and I was hoping that you could elucidate for us the issue for the public, and you've done a good job of that. So really what we're looking at is that we, as you've suggested, can't criminalize status, but there are time, place, and manner restrictions that we can place on camping. I feel that in general, these recommendations have done a good job of doing that and put us in a place where we can enforceably where we can legally enforce, I guess, this statute that would prevent the type of issue with homeless people and others camping in ways that we've received a lot of important public feedback around. So I appreciate the work that's gone into this. I'm generally in favor of what we've got in front of us, and I'm interested in hearing from other council members as well. Thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem Montoya.
Thank you, Mayor. Joe, I think I would agree with what Councilman Tenney said. I think largely the work that's been done subsequent to the last draft of this ordinance amendment has been better than what we saw before, significantly. I'll tell you honestly, the only issue that I have a little bit of pause on is the private property component. And for me, anytime we start heavily regulating what other people are doing with their personal and private property, it doesn't sit super great with me. I guess, I think about instances where I know people in this community who've built homes, for instance, and they've brought an RV in while they're supervising the building of their home. And I worry about unintended consequences in manners like that or situations like that where, and this is the danger of overly regulating anything is unintended consequences. So I guess I'm curious if you could speak to is there a distinction if someone was going to vacant property, or would I guess what I'm asking you is, as this is currently written, let's imagine that I bought a vacant piece of property in Prescott and I was building a home on it and I brought an RV in to stay at that RV while the building of my home was happening. It sounds like, if I'm reading this correctly right now, I could only be there for 14 days at a time, 5 times throughout the year before I would be running afoul of this ordinance. Is that correct?
Actually, that's somewhat correct. And I'll get into why RVs are specifically exempted from this ordinance, and because they're treated directly in our land development code. And so RVs, actually, you wouldn't be able to stay on an RV on a property waiting for it to be built.
So okay, just so to clarify, as it exists right now within our land development code, when people do that, they're breaking the law.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so it's just, I guess in my mind, we have to think this through to make sure we're not creating a bigger problem than that we're not intending to. So I guess, again, by and large, I'm in favor of this ordinance significantly. I think it's, especially the restriction in the downtown entertainment district. I'm in favor of the idea of not allowing encampments to build up. I just, anytime we start taking away or depriving people of their private property rights, I go back to Council Member Roosing's issue, which is I want it to be legally defensible. So that's a concern for me.
And I definitely appreciate your feedback, and I would like to hear what council has to say on that private property issue. And I want to kind of clarify where we're at currently in our ordinance as it stands today, assuming that our ordinance was totally enforceable. It does not regulate camping on private property much. The only regulations are, A, when it comes to RVs, you're not allowed to use RVs on private property unless you've had a fire or natural disaster. And then there's a 9-month permit to use it. And B, any other type of camping, including tent camping and so forth, is allowed currently as long as you have permission from the landowner. So there's a lot between where we currently are and the draft. There's a lot of a big area we can fall. I'll say that in the county, there is an ordinance that allows for camping on your property in an RV or other structure while that house is being built. And that might be something we'd want to consider. I mean, but the county allows it specifically, we don't.
Mayor, if I may, very quickly, I would be in favor in seeing something that contemplates that usage, because I do know there are a lot of people who purchase parcels here with the idea of building on them, and I don't want to have unintended consequences. That's just my thought.
Councilwoman Cantelmi.
Thank you, Mayor. Joe, I'm in favor of this. I'd like to see one thing happen, and maybe we can't do it. I'd like to see much stricter penalties. And is there any way of defining what these penalties are? Because the thing that I would hate to see happen is just issue a ticket time and time again, and nothing ever happens. Is it against the law to put number 2, step 2, after this initial violation, where you have just a citation? Could there be a financial penalty as a step 2 and have it clearly spelled out? Maybe it's $500. I mean, how do we keep giving people a pass? How can we make this make them pay attention the first time and not the 20th time?
Well, to answer that quickly and briefly, we can't give more punishment than we currently given. We're limited to this misdemeanor level of punishment under city ordinances. So the citation would be to move immediately, but any misdemeanor prosecution is the same for any city ordinance, and it doesn't build up. For example, shoplifting is a misdemeanor that is a certain level of misdemeanor, but if there's 3 or more shoplifting events, it can be bumped up to a felony. There's no way to do that for city ordinances. It will just be a misdemeanor, but there is a monetary penalty attached to it, or can be, depending on the court's discretion. And there can be jail time, depending on the court's discretion. They'll look at history, including multiple misdemeanors, when making those types of sentences.
So, but the path right now is after the citation is issued and they come back and they reoffend, they're issued another misdemeanor, and then they appear in front of the court, and then the court decides if they get another citation or they get some...
There would be a misdemeanor then on their record, and the court will decide amongst the possible misdemeanor punishments, which includes some jail time, some fine time, and other things. And so every misdemeanor has that same kind of range of sentencing, fines, jail time, and so it will be that way going forward.
So what do we have as a history in that right now? Do you know? What have we done historically for this after a second offense? Do we keep track of that?
I can't answer that question.
Okay.
And to give you an answer on keeping track, we have new software that is being installed currently. We'll be able to track, but we couldn't track going backwards.
Okay, thank you.
Councilman Moore.
Thank you, Mayor. Joe, I appreciate the work you've done. I think this ordinance strikes a good balance. I especially like the wording where it says nothing in this article shall be construed to criminalize homelessness, target the homeless community, or otherwise criminalize an individual's status rather than the individual's conduct. I think that's a really important statement in the ordinance. And I think that there are enough teeth in this ordinance that we can prevent camping except for time, place, and manner. And that's exactly what we're legally allowed to do. So I've certainly been in favor of the change in this ordinance from the old ordinance.
Councilman Shishka.
Thank you, Mayor. Joe, is this going to make things more easily enforceable for our law enforcement officers?
Yes, and I think that's the entire idea, is to give our law enforcement officers clear guidelines on what they can and can't arrest or cite, and then it's also enforceable, it's constitutional, so it allows better, clearer enforcement.
Councilman Tenney.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate the clarification that we received on the penalty aspect of things, and it's important for me to remember that we're a legislative body and not a judicial body, and so the penalties that are imposed for this, again, it sounds like we're limited to misdemeanor. That'll be up to the courts and not up to us. That's important for me to know as I make recommendations or approve things or whatnot. So thank you for that clarification.
Yeah, I'll say that concerning condemned properties, that the property itself or the building is condemned because it's unsafe to occupy. But the ground itself doesn't have the same safety concerns. So it would be very difficult to keep somebody from camping, at least temporarily, on a private property outside of a condemned building. But we do have a remedy here that limits it to those 14 days.
And I agree with that. I think just thinking it through, trying to figure out how an increased level of enforcement and restriction on a property with a condemned building as opposed to another property would be hard to show the rational basis for that. But it's something we can explore.
Yeah, I think that's important for us to always keep in mind that this has to be a defensible ordinance. Because I think we've seen throughout the western United States and other places throughout the country where homeless encampments were established and then grew and expanded dramatically. And then trying to reel in and eliminate them after they've become almost impossible to contain became extremely negatively impacted on that community. So if we have a well-crafted ordinance that our police department can immediately engage in whoever might be violating this ordinance, then we can keep it from growing and expanding and becoming a community detriment. Councilman Moore?
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate Councilman Tenney's comment about being a legislative body and not a judicial body, but I do have a question from an enforcement standpoint, Joe. If you're a private citizen and you are aware of camping somewhere that's particularly public land, like I hike, for example, a lot in the community. One of my favorite trails is the Constellation Trail, and it's not uncommon for me to find camping gear near the trail. How is this going to be reported? Is it the citizens' responsibility? I mean, the police aren't going to be out hiking trails looking for encampments. So I just want to ask the question of enforceability, because I think that's an important consideration that we need to look at.
And I don't know if a representative from the PD wants to address that, but from my perspective, it'd be enforced as any other crime is enforced, meaning if an officer sees it while patrolling, sure, they'll do something, or they'll receive complaints or calls in, just like any other crime. But do you want to address that?
Sure. Yeah, as with any of our laws or current ordinances that we have in place, if it's something that we see that we find enforceable or a violation of that law or ordinance, we take action when we're able to. Anything else, a trail or someplace that's not readily accessible or visible on a regular basis, somebody could certainly call and we would investigate and handle that as we could.
Thank you, Chief. I think we'll take public comment now. I know we have quite a few comment cards. So again, the limitation on the amount of comment is 3 minutes each. And I would ask you that if you hear from a previous speaker on the same issues you're concerned about, I would recommend that if you have something new to offer on this issue, then please, you're welcome to do that. But if it's just a repetition of what's already been said, we still have 2 more ordinances to deal with, and we want to keep it appropriate, timely, and allow appropriate comments from the public.
Sherry Hanna.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mayor Good and council members. My name is Sherry Hanna, and I live at 2503 Willow Creek Road here in Prescott. I grew up here, obviously a long time resident of Prescott. I'm not going to tell you how long. I am here in support of adding any wording necessary to strengthen our current city camping ordinance. Currently, we live in a very difficult financial times with high inflation, and we are all feeling the sting of it. Many people have fallen on hard times and find themselves homeless, victims of substance abuse and mental health issues. Prescott is a very compassionate community, and we have many organizations that support the less fortunate and those that are struggling with needs. In these times when individuals or groups push the bounds of camping restrictions in our city attorney and law enforcement must have strict camping ordinances in place in order to prosecute within the law all who would disrupt the peace and tranquility of our community by instituting strong language of our community in our camping ordinance now in order to prohibit any of the infractions from occurring in the future. The proposed wording needs to be strengthened to our current city camping ordinance in order to protect the health, safety, and preserve the quality of life for all our residents of our city, including our homeless and less fortunate. Our city attorney has obviously done his due diligence on how far we are allowed to pursue this issue. So as our city leaders, I strongly request and respectfully urge you when the time comes that you vote to institute the proper verbiage in our new camping ordinance that will safeguard our community and protect our quality of life when you vote for this new camping ordinance. Thank you.
Linda Bray. Linda Bray.
Oops, sorry, didn't hear. My name is Linda Bray, and Sherry covered what I wanted to say, but I want to do this. I want you to please consider California for a minute, a state determined to make all the wrong decisions all the time. Over a 4-year period from 2018 to 2022, a legendary $17.5 billion was spent to help the homeless. In 2017, the population was 134,000 homeless people, or the unhoused as we now call them. After throwing billions of dollars at this program, counts now show anywhere from 160 to 170,000 homeless. If you build it, they will come. California government officials tout their compassion, yet large numbers of the homeless live within their own bodily fluids, and a large percentage die of drug overdose. I am with you that we need to restrict this as much as we legally can. Thank you.
Cowboy Dave.
I'll get it back in there. Maybe not. Mayor Good, council members, you know, we all want to be compassionate, but none of us, especially you as council members, should allow complacency. City Attorney, you made several mentions about 14-day restriction. So what do you do when an encampment is set up? You have 2 people that are now given a notice of 14 days. And the very next day, you now have 30 people. Are they given 14 days? And the very next day, you have 50 people. Are they given 14 days? It is a never-ending battle. Learn from California's mistakes. California, and I lived there my entire life up until 5 years ago, is now a third world nation. It will never recover. I had a recent conversation with Sheriff Rhodes. I will not quote, but I will paraphrase. They get the job done. They've learned from the history of the past. There's an encampment. Everybody is given the 14-day notice. After 14 days, that encampment is broken down. If people come back, they are incarcerated. Now, to his credit, they do have a program. And maybe that's what we should be looking at, is a program to help these people, to give them a hand up, not a lifetime hand out, because that's what they will take advantage of. As a private owner, is it going to be up to me to call the police department and say that I've got somebody who's camping on my property, and then all of a sudden the police come to me and say, well, they've got 14 days to stay here? It isn't going to happen, because I'm not going to see my property get demeaned and degraded. As council members, you have an obligation to protect the interest of the city of Prescott, not just the entertainment area. That's your responsibility. You talk about the entertainment area, we all get it. It's tourism dollars. And what happens to the family that's coming out late after dinner? They're with their family, they're with their children, and now all of a sudden it's 8:05 and they get accosted. Whose responsibility is that now? It's yours, each and every one of you.
Please conclude your remarks.
I will. You have a responsibility. Do what is right for the entire city, not just for the high tax value. And also, final remarks in my conversation with Dave Rhodes. He made it very clear. There may be homeless, but they're not stupid. They go where the higher tax value population lives. And they've learned that from history also. Do your jobs. Protect the entire city of Prescott, not just the downtown area.
Mayor, if I could.
Go ahead, Joe.
Could I just address a few of those issues?
Please respond.
There's no 14-day notice. It's a 24-hour notice. Also, if someone's camping on your private property, that's trespassing. That's not allowed. Private property, we were talking about people who own the property camping on their own property. That is where the 14-day comes into account. If you're camping on someone else's private property, that's trespassing. It's not allowed. It's a 0-minute notice before the police will go take care of that. So just to clarify, the time, manner, place restrictions apply to the whole city, not just the downtown entertainment district. There is not a 14-day free camping period. It is 24 hours to remove themselves, and camping on someone else's private property is not allowed for a single minute.
Edward Wolf.
Thank you all for letting me come here today to speak to you and address my feelings on this problem. And I look at this as the big picture. The homeless problem just didn't start. It's been going on for several years now. It's a concerted effort by the socialist communists for a long time to exploit these folks across a lot of major cities in the USA. Their goal is to eventually tear down cities and make socialism the new way of the land. The folks who favor tent cities should show up by example their humanism and bring as many of the homeless as possible into their homes, feed, clothe, and house them, put the homeless on their medical policy, and supply them with their cash. Let's see if this example would be agreed upon. I doubt it. The homeless need treatment for many of the problems, including addiction, mental illness, military injuries, plus no work ethic, panhandling, and freeloading, and most of all, hoping everyone else will help. Many rehabs were closed because of operational costs to towns and cities. The homeless were left to fend for themselves. The town of Prescott depends on tourism and sales tax for its ability to function and thrive. Tourists will not come here with a tent city of any kind in place. Sales tax will diminish and quality of life for the citizens of Prescott will go downhill as well. The state and federal government are not doing their job to solve this serious problem. This problem is killing cities across the United States. The socialist communists are using the homeless as pawns to further their agenda to destroy America from within. We, the people of Prescott, say no to any tent city. I urge the City Council to vote no on this detrimental idea. Have the courage to be part of the solution by voting no tent city instead of creating another problem. Use laws and ordinance to help curb this problem. And I thank you all for listening.
Mayor, if I may, I just probably need to address that as well.
Sure.
As to the idea of tent cities, I'm just pointing out place regulations that's on there. There's no camping at any time within 500 feet of someone else who's camping, which would basically eliminate tent cities unless they're all 500 feet apart. It's also no camping from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., which makes sure that people are packing up and moving. That prohibits tent cities.
They don't do that.
Where do they go?
Please.
We don't have that ordinance in place. This is an ordinance. It's up to, law enforcement will take care of that. The point is, we don't have tent cities now. We've dismantled them. And this makes our enforcement against possible tent cities even stronger.
Eileen Wolf.
Good afternoon. My name is Eileen Wolf. Thank you, Phil Good, and council members. People today actually choose to be homeless, not that they are in need. For example, in California, college graduates recently decided to be homeless even though they had a means to have a roof over their heads. I found this out yesterday. Some people choose not to go into recovery from alcoholism and drug addiction. Well, the residents of Prescott, who are taxpayers, have a choice too. We do not want a tent city in our town. Today's culture promotes taking money from the government, while we in Prescott believe in hard work and resiliency. We are not people who are not caring, but we do not believe in enabling unacceptable behavior. The people who are slipping through the cracks due to mental illness, drug addiction, of course, we want them to be helped, but helping is not allowing them to sleep from 8 p.m. to in the morning. Helping is offering AA, NA meetings, group homes, residential treatment facilities, and for those who choose recovery. But there's a lot of people who do not choose recovery, and that's their issue. There is a crisis for mental illness, definitely across the nation, and we all know there's a suicide crisis as well. Well, back to the 1980s, a lot of the mental institutions have been closed down. It's not your fault, it's not our fault, but they were closed down. These institutions need to be opened up for nationwide for the severely mentally ill, so they can be treated in a humane manner and not to be allowed to be sleeping on the streets of Prescott from 8 p.m. to the morning. This is a federal and state issue that needs to be addressed. So please, try to make stringent laws to reduce the amount of sleeping on our streets and to try to organize federal and state to be addressed to get the mentally ill treated where they need to be. And thank you very much.
Lauren Higgins.
Good afternoon, council members. Thank you for receiving me. Unlike my other citizens, I'm an Arizonian. I came from Tucson. This is our own backyard. I came from the Davis-Monthan area. I retired from there. I worked at the Boneyard, if any of you are familiar with that. We had the homeless camps, the tenting, all that around the base, federal. And it took an act, literally an act of Congress, to remove those folks. It is in our backyard. You know it's in our backyard. And I know all good intentions are paved with kindness. But I lived it. My wife lived it. We've seen it. We see what happens. We come up here, we see the beautiful courthouse. kids on the weekends walking around barefoot. You're not going to have that. It's all going to go away. I can't take my children in the Tucson area to go barefoot. There's needles, there's drugs, there's feces, it's everywhere. And lastly, I would like to say, I hear about the people, the homeless. My heart goes out to them, it really does. But what about the taxpayer? What about the citizen, what we pay and what we do, and we ask for the right intentions from our elected officials? I'll leave you with that, because it is us. They live here for free. It's my taxpayers, or our taxpayers, that's going to pay for the cleanup. It's going to pay for our police department to patrol. And I'll leave you with this one more thing. Mr. Moore, if you've been up to Devil Dog to go hiking, don't. Williams is infested with homeless camps in the woods already. Thank you for your time.
Kathleen Clark.
I'm glad that transgender isn't on the agenda today because I am not Kathleen Clark.
Mr. Siegel, you've already addressed the council.
This is on behalf of Kathleen
I'm
Clark.
sorry,
These are
she's
questions
not here.
that she's asked me
You're
to
out of
provide.
order. You're out of order.
Okay, very good. And for the record, City Attorney, nobody was given your presentation. I specifically asked for a copy, and the young lady said there was not one drafted in advance for us to read.
Ron Brown.
I have two brief comments. One is about enforcement. I understand that there is a noise ordinance in the city and right around the courthouse, and any night the noise ordinance is not enforced. During the winter, the sidewalks in front of residences and businesses are supposed to be cleared by ordinance, and anybody could walk around just the downtown district and say that the sidewalks on certain businesses and certain residences are not cleared, and that remains that way for weeks at a time, causing a hazard to older people that live in the city and pay the taxes. The other comment I have is on the term homeless. Homeless is a catch-all for mentally ill and drug addicted and somewhat criminal behavior. The question I have about homeless is, did they have a home in this area and lost it and are now on the street? Or have they come from somewhere else because it's an easy hit, or to get out of 110 degrees in Phoenix, where homelessness, which is including mentally ill, criminals, and people that may have lost their residences there, have come here. So that catch-all term of homeless, I think, has to be examined and broken down to what the different elements are. And if the case is taken to court, I think those terms have to be readdressed. Homeless, mentally ill, criminal, and drug addicted. Thank you.
Lori Rayner.
Good afternoon, Mayor and City Council members. My name is Lori Reiner. I live in Prescott. My family and I are very concerned about what is happening all over the country with 10 cities and various encampments that are out of control. They are seriously deteriorating and affecting the quality of life for all of their citizens and visitors. I grew up in New York City, my hometown, and I am sickened by what once great city has now become. I have lived in another once great city, San Francisco. It is now doomed due to uncontrolled drug use, disease spread, and due to defecation in its streets. Do the right thing. Vote no. Vote no, including no camping on private property. Thank you.
Cindy Lee Davies.
Hello, Mayor Good and councilmen and women. I'm Cindy Lee Davies. Sorry, I wasn't going to speak today, but I did grow up in Prescott and I've been here 47 years. Yes, I was born in Oceanside. I think you guys, just the little bit that I've learned over the last not even 12 hours when I got notice to this was happening, I think you're doing a good job on putting stuff in place. So I agree. My one question is, you said about holding property. I do own a rental property or two. I have to give them 30 days notice. How are you going to find them to hold their property? And I know that might be a loaded question. If they've left their stuff, what happens?
I can answer that, Mayor, if you'd like. So the ordinance calls for people being arrested or moved have 24 hours to move that property. If they don't, the property is seized and a note will be left at the location. That's the noticing mechanism.
Perfect. Thank you. So I know I have a whole bunch of other things going on in my mind, but I just think that we do have to keep this strong, firm, and I think that's what everybody's come together to make sure happens, to keep our town. It is everybody's hometown. We all know that. But I grew up here, and it's always been a safe, welcoming, warm town, and we do want to keep it that way. So thank you for all of your time and effort, and everybody else showing up and speaking too.
Deborah Pernice.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you, Mayor and City Council. And Mr. Young, I want to commend you all, and Ms. Seep as well, for addressing this issue and making sure that we do meet the Ninth Circuit scrutiny. Most of you who know me know that I practiced law for over 30 years, and a good part of it was in Orange County, California. And I represented public agencies, and specifically actually was involved in the homeless encampment litigation that I think was involved the Kennedy Commission, and it was a real legal Lollapalooza. So I appreciate Mr. Young's proactive and the council's proactive efforts to address this issue. And I also want to validate Mrs. Wolf's comments and some of the other persons, because during the discovery phase of this litigation that I was involved in, I learned that many of these people, although in sorry circumstances and certainly deserving of compassion, many of them were not necessarily involuntarily homeless. And as Mrs. Wolf pointed out, some of them are just addicts, and I call them free-range addicts because they choose not to go to these shelters. They're free-range. They just go where they want to, and I don't think it's fair. We do have to impose proper health, safety, and welfare restrictions, and I'm happy to volunteer my time if anybody wants it over here, but I'm not licensed here in Arizona. But anyway, what else did I want to say here? I think I've addressed it, but I think it's entirely reasonable, and I think the law is very, very strict, and I do commend the council and Mr. Young for trying to make sure that we will withstand Ninth Circuit scrutiny, because I just got a notice in email yesterday that in the Daily Journal that the Ninth Circuit is going to be taking another look at these restrictions in the San Francisco area. So please, I thank you very much for all your efforts. It's very important that we do that. And I will mention that the last time I was in Los Angeles, I was in 2020. I was in trial. I can show you the picture of the encampments there. I can't give you the whiff of the odor, and that was true also in Orange County. We had homeless encampments in the courthouse plaza for years, and it took years to get them out of there. So we need to be very proactive and enforce this, try and beef up these ordinances, make sure that we can enforce them, and make sure our law enforcement has the proper tools. Thank you.
Douglas Eckenrod.
Well, council members, this looks like it'd be a tough day for you. But Mr. Young, I don't feel sorry for you because we're not going to allow you to lay down on this. After 21 years of law enforcement, I'll explain this, Clark. After 21 years of law enforcement, I retired as the Deputy Director of California State Parole. I retired last January. And as you might imagine, I had probably the most detailed cohort of the homeless population of where exactly they are living, with 1,800 law enforcement personnel checking in on them daily. And quite a few city attorneys have fallen into the trap that I think that you've fallen into. And I'm not disrespecting you. You've got a very difficult job. But you've made an interpretation, an over-interpretation about what the Ninth Circuit Court ruling has done. And you've provided sort of like a backdrop here that, hey, we're up against this immutable pressure, and so we've got to acquiesce ahead of time. And folks, it's not true. It's not true. We're not litigating, we're not punishing a status, as you rightly said. We're talking about a behavior. And the councilwoman on this end, ma'am, you hit it right on the head. What are the penalties when you break the law? And there are some things that can happen. Fines go up, right, for repeat offenders. And also the idea, just like if you trespass at Walmart and you get a trespass, what happens when you get seen again by law enforcement? Sir, you can answer that, I'm sure, without, you know what happens. You're kicked off immediately once you have a trespass placed on you. So there are some tools in the tool bag, but I wanted to share just a little bit of data. So I had 55,000 parolees under my purview, 1,800 folks tracking them. 5,000 of the 55,000 were homeless in 2018. What did the state do? They loaded down, like if some of my friends back here already said, loaded down money and resources and city council attorneys, and I'm sorry to be picking on you, but you're here. City council attorneys misinterpreted, overreacted to some of the backstops and used the specter of the Ninth Circuit Court and these other things. And they built legislation that watered down the penalties for these homeless encampments. And guess what I got as I was exiting the door of California, actually escaping maybe is a better term, but as I was exiting the door from California, my homelessness rate, it went from 10%. Does anybody want to take a guess at what it went to? How about in the crowd? Does anybody want to take a guess at what my homelessness rate went to? It doubled. And guess what came with the doubling? Homicides, sexual assaults, and violence. In fact, you could overlay a heat map of the municipalities that took this stance, and you could overlay that heat map with where crime had spiked, especially certain zip codes, mainly in Southern California and the Bay Area. It doesn't surprise anybody here. And so, look, I'm not here to pick on you guys. You have a tough job. Sir, I feel for you. But I'm asking you guys to work a little bit harder. Don't be afraid to be sued. You're not going to be reckless with Prescott City Code, right? You've got to work within the law, but you also don't overreact and lower the bar so low that you're going to get run over. So I respect you guys very much. You've got a very difficult job. Sir, I'd be glad to carry water for you, buy you lunch, whatever it takes to help you with this thing here. But just know, if you're not taking flack, you're not over the target. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you.
Elaine Jenks.
Good afternoon. Thank you. And I really, really like this guy. We fled California, and we don't want Prescott to get Californicated. And that's what's going on right now. We have to remember that compassion without discipline is chaos. We've witnessed it all across our country. And we don't want Prescott to turn into that. Prescott has always been kind of a heroic place where people aren't afraid to stand up and say their piece. I mean, we can actually talk politics in a restaurant without worrying about who's listening. That's what Prescott is, and that this gentleman is wanting all of you to remember. Don't forget who you are, and don't forget who Prescott is. And bringing it back down to Prescott, we're already seeing the effects of this lawlessness, homelessness, perversion right here in our little neighborhood. My neighborhood is adjacent to Acker Park. We've always walked Acker Park a couple times a day. All the ladies, it's just kind of, let's go walk the park. We don't walk the park anymore. Our park is full of homeless, people doing sexual things in the bathrooms. The debris women have been harassed and chased out of the park by the homeless. So my big question here is, ma'am, Do we have enough law enforcement to enforce these wonderful new ordinances, which we do need more muscle in? But if we're not getting in Acker Park, right 2 miles from downtown, the enforcement and regulating and control of the homeless, how are we going to start effectively enforcing these ordinances? It's not happening now. And I don't think we're out hiring a lot of extra police officers because we, in a beautiful neighborhood adjacent to Acker Park, no longer use our park. Unless you got a really big dog or a really big gun on you. We stay out of it, right? And then I have another question. If a police officer does give someone a little ticket for camping in a public area, and the police officer notices that that person is under the influence of illegal drugs or mentally ill, what next? How do we keep that person off our streets? What is going on long term to end this? I'll let the police officer address my questions. Thank you very much for your time.
Allison Leneker.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Allison Leneker. I'm the Executive Director of the Coalition for Compassion and Justice. Thank you. So I completely understand that no one wants us to become California. I think that I'm pretty safe to speak for not only myself, but the other social services here in town that we actually don't want anyone camping. I don't want to see anyone on sidewalks, and we actually discourage that greatly within the populations that we serve. But here's the thing is, and Joe, thank you so much. I do want to give you some credit because you've asked for our opinions, and I really appreciate being asked to the table. But here's my question is, we're talking a lot about what I'm assuming is younger, healthier males, females, whatever, that are camping right now. The face of homelessness is not that. As you may or may not know, there is Canyon Run Apartments, which houses right now low-income seniors, disabled veterans. This time next year, their rent will be raised to above fair market and they will all be experiencing homelessness. So my question is because the Ninth Circuit Court does make it very difficult for this sort of ordinance to be upheld, and I work really closely with Prescott PD, so I understand their frustration. What is the alternative? Where do we tell people to go? Because I'm not sure if I read it on this version, but there was a stat that said we had over 300 shelter beds. That is inaccurate. Currently, right now, my shelter, which I can take up to 13 people a night, which I do keep beds open for law enforcement, is full every night. And so is everyone else who's running shelters. I'm also the only true emergency shelter, which means you don't have to have an intake or an interview. You can just come right in. So if there's only that many beds, what's the alternative? Where do people go? I completely share everyone's emotion on this issue. We don't want to see human beings having to camp.
Please speak into the microphone for the record, please.
Oh, sorry. But what's the alternative? We have affordable housing that's going away. We're not building affordable housing other than a couple of projects. So I really urge everyone to not only just kind of think about that and know that right now I have at least 5 out of the 10 to 12 individuals in my shelter who are over 70, 2 of which have diagnoses of Alzheimer's and dementia. So where do we go? I've heard a lot of people say that we're a compassionate community. I 100% agree. But we kind of have to think a little bit outside the box on this one. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Bailey Sanders.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Bailey Sanders. It's nice to see you all. This is my first time speaking up here, so please forgive me if I speak fast or I'm a little shaky. I am a third-generation Prescottonian here raising the fourth. I own a small business downtown, and I serve on the board of a lot of nonprofits. one being the Prescott Downtown Partnership. For the better part of 2 years, I have managed the events downtown on the Courthouse Plaza and a majority of the surrounding events there too. We have had an increased issue with the homeless population on the plaza, defecating, yelling at the students that come from Mile High, and my son goes to Mile High now, and we love using that Granite Creek corridor. It's one of the best pieces of Prescott. Thank you, Tyler. But as it stands right now, we cannot use the corridor in the mornings to go to and from school because there are people sleeping on the corridor. I have had time to review this ordinance, and I think there are a couple of things that we should change, specifically the personal property piece of it. I think if we keep that piece within the ordinance, you're going to have a lot of backlash that goes along with it. I think removing that ordinance will help us push a lot of this piece through. It was also stated that there was a warning system in place within the ordinance. I am failing to see this warning system in place. My father was also a police officer with Chief Bonney in the early 2000s, and back then they were allowed to remove homeless population from the Prescott area. And in doing so, I can speak from personal seeing it, it's hard to watch. So I think that there is a happy medium here in a way that we can work with the local shelters. And you know that there's only one local shelter in town, and it is religion-based. So keep that in mind. And I think there is a piece to be able to work with the local shelters and enforce some type of warning system, because the second that you start enforcing additional fines puts somebody in jeopardy. And I don't know if you remember several years back what happened in Cottonwood when the police tried to approach a homeless person that was squatting on the Cottonwood Walmart property. There were guns involved, and it was not a good outcome. So when you start enforcing financial regulations on somebody who's already hitting hard times, you are putting our police force at a greater risk. So I really do encourage you to try and formulate some type of warning system within this ordinance as it stands. Thank you for your time.
Judy Saltrop.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council people, City Attorney. Thank you. I'm coming to you today because I live very close to Prescott National Forest, and I just want to make sure that we don't have unintended consequences of pushing people into the forest. I'm sure you're aware that Prescott National Forest is the top fire shed in the western United States. So having homeless or encampments out there, you know, that are unregulated and not, managed, it could be a concern. I certainly don't want a forest fire. That's what happened up in Flagstaff. So I'm here today to talk about that. Also, I also wanted to suggest that there might be a task force that you work with the sheriff, the Forest Service, police department, Terrell's Health, so that there's a coordination. I know that happened on the other side of the mountain, where they have a communication so that they can quickly address homelessness and make sure that people are put where they need to be, so that we don't, it helps people track, so that if they're moved from one area to another, there is a concerted response so that we can kind of address the root issue and not just, you know, worry about one little section pushing it out to other areas. I also just have to say that I don't think that our city council meetings should be talking about California. I think they should be talking about Prescott. And I understand that a lot of people moved here from California, but we're not California. And I think that should just stay somewhere else, because I want to talk about Prescott. Thank you.
Rebecca Horniman.
You know, I'm going to take one more public comment. We still have two ordinances to review here before our end of this study session by 3 o'clock. So we'll take one more, and then I'll have to call it a conclude the public comments.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. My name is Rebecca Horniman. I am also a third-generation Prescottonian, and our group owns several businesses in downtown Prescott in the entertainment district, and I am grateful for this study session. I do have a couple of questions after reading the ordinance. The first being, is the police force going to be funded extra money to enforce this ordinance? And maybe these questions can be answered now or at a later date. The second is the Sheriff's Office on board for this because, as the last commenter presented, this will be pushed out into the county. We're surrounded by National Forest. We're surrounded by county. County as close as the Courthouse Square, county property as close as Mountain Club, county property as close as Williamson Valley. So I'd like to bring in the sheriff to these conversations. He was not aware of today's meeting. And will he be paying for any incarceration? Currently, the Sheriff's Office has a diversion program which tries to divert incarceration. The program exists because of large number of substance abuse and mental disability individuals that wind up in the system. It's important to understand also that the minute a person is incarcerated, they lose their federal benefits, which includes Medicaid and Social Security. So the system is overwhelmed and is getting back on the programs is lengthy. Currently, the county has to pay for the mental health and medical needs of persons in the county jails, and this has become a high expense. The issue is huge, and it is an issue across Arizona. So I'd like some of those issues to be addressed. And if this is a study session, we should be studying the root cause of homelessness. The Housing First model is the best model to address these issues and concerns. If a person has shelter, they are then able to get medical attention and receive services that will help them get off the streets. And how is the city going to provide temporary shelter and services? What are the costs of these services? Who are the partners in the community that the city and council are collaborating with to resolve these issues? So those are my questions, and I'm grateful for the study sessions to be able to answer those questions and have them addressed before this goes to a vote. Thank you.
As I said, I think we need to move on to the two other additional ordinances we're going to review here because we only have about 40 minutes left. So we'll proceed to Section 5-1-3 for the curfew.
Thank you, Mayor. The next two sections should be fairly minor, and I'm guessing that we'll have much less commentary on them. This is the curfew for minors section, Mr. Mayor. Currently, there are exceptions. The curfew within the city is 10 o'clock p.m. for minors. There's exceptions for emergencies and for various things. We have suggested adding one exception to the current document, which is an E, and I've highlighted that in red. Basically, this section allows for minors coming and going to religious or school events to be allowed to be out after that 10 o'clock. And we see it most often in sporting events where people come back from games from Kingman or from the Valley, and they're driving from the high school back to their house. Currently, they're technically in violation of the curfew ordinance, and it allows, where there's prior permission from the parents involved in a school, religious, or civic activity, to not be in violation of the ordinance. That's it. I'm willing to take any questions. Probably not public comment, looks like.
That was a short one. Mayor Pro Tem Montoya.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. I'm sorry. My question will be hopefully relatively short here. I just, are we defining minor in this sense as age 16 and below, or is it 18 and below? I just clarification for my.
It's 18 and below, but 16 and below have additional restrictions.
Okay. I've been having a conversation with my 16-year-old about what curfew is, and so I just want to make sure that I'm on the right side of this. So if I tell her you can't be out during these hours, I'm in the right here.
That's correct.
Unless she's coming from her job. So I want to make sure I understand. She's going to be very disappointed to know that she's lost this argument. Thank you.
That's accurate.
Well, she can always enlist in the military. Councilman Tenney?
Thank you, Mayor. Quick clarification. I think I heard 18 and below would be minors. Is that 18-year-olds are not typically minors? Is that correct? Or
Sorry, under the age of 18. And I should say that if they're under the age of 16, that's where the 10 o'clock curfew comes into play. Over 16, so 17, is midnight currently under the ordinance. But this just adds the provision that if you're out for a school, religious, or civic event, that you are not in violation of curfew.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Sorry, I'm just to clarify this further, because again, I do have a 6-year-old. Is it 16 and below is 10 o'clock, or is it at 16 it goes or is it 17 then you go to midnight? I'm just trying to.
It goes to midnight when they hit 16.
So she's okay. All right.
Yep.
Any other questions or comments? Do we have any public comment on this one?
Nope.
Looking around in the council chambers, I don't think anybody qualifies under here, so that's fine. We'll move on to the aggressive solicitation ordinance.
Thank you, Mayor. Again, a few changes, not a whole lot, but just want to get into them specifically what they are. So the aggressive solicitation ordinance prohibits aggressive solicitation as it's defined, which includes badgering, pestering, in a way that might be threatening or intimidating. But in the prohibitions against these acts, it's both aggressive solicitation and other certain acts are prohibited. And so those other specific acts are what we are dealing with here. And as you can see, I've highlighted the changes, but we have increased the distance from certain, and I have got some feedback that we should make the distance uniform, but just to go through them quickly, we are suggesting that the distance that a solicitation can be made from a bus stop, taxi stand, transit stop, or any public transportation vehicle be extended to 25 feet. And the distance from a bank, ATM, or so forth extended to 50 feet, and within 25 feet from the entrance of any commercial business or establishment. We have also recommended that we extend to 25 feet the distance that persons can solicit from a patio area near a business. And then finally, the biggest change is that section I that you can see there, which prohibits solicitation of any sort from moving vehicles, whether they're moving or at a traffic control device. So that's kind of the major question. I'd be interested in council's feedback on the distance, whether make it a uniform 50 or otherwise, and the provision that prohibits soliciting from a vehicle.
Councilmember Rusing.
Thank you. In my travels around Prescott, I have seen panhandlers literally sitting on the curb right next to the tires of vehicles as they're trying to pass, most notably on Gail Gardner and Iron Springs, for example, right there by the Big O tire, and that's very unsafe, and we need to make sure that nothing happens to the panhandler or the poor driver of the vehicle who accidentally runs over the person. And I think that this is something that we need to clear up, because I looked at the old ordinance and it was very unclear, as to distance from like an ATM machine or a business. And I think we need to make it uniform. Under the draft, some cases are 25, some are 50. And I think for enforcement and also for compliance, I think if everyone had this 50-foot restriction, I think it would make it easier on everybody involved. But that's just a suggestion. Thank you.
And I think that's a good one. I'd be interested to see if that's direction from council as a whole. I will say that we changed it from primarily 15 feet to the 25 and 25 to the 50 feet. So that's where you see the differences. It was 15 and 25. We changed it to 25 and 50. But a uniform 50, I think, is enforceable as well. The point is, to make it, if we want to make it consistent, we can do that. And that's why I'm looking for feedback.
Councilman Moore.
Thank you, Mayor.
Joe, I just want to ask a question. Under Section 1, where it says prohibited acts, it says it shall be unlawful for any person or group to solicit money or other things of value or to solicit the sale of goods or services. Then it has the A, in an aggressive manner in a public area or. And then the or lists, is that B, C, D, E, F, G, H, and I? The word or is in that sentence of A is throwing me off a little bit. So I want to understand what you're referring to with the letter or, because sometimes we talk about may, shall. What's or? What's it referring to?
Well, so in 510.2, which are the prohibited acts, the A through J are all of the prohibited acts, any one of them. So if it's in aggressive manner, then it's prohibited. And aggressive is defined earlier in the ordinance. But then also if it's from a moved vehicle, it's prohibited. The or is merely, there's an or in each one of the A through J to indicate that each of those is a violation of the act, independent of the other.
So I guess my question, and I'm going to piggyback onto Councilwoman Rusing's comments. I personally have a concern with individuals standing on street corners soliciting, and I'm wondering if I would completely eliminate individuals standing on street corners, or if it only eliminate aggressive behaviors if they're standing on street corners.
No, it defines any soliciting at street corners as being unlawful under the ordinance. It wouldn't have to also be aggressive.
Okay, one further question, I'm sorry. It talks about traffic or on a public street or stopped for a traffic control device. I think a lot of this occurs at business entrances where there isn't a traffic signal or necessarily a stop sign. Like, for example, my business was in the Safeway Shopping Center for about 17 years, and there's not a stop sign exiting the shopping center, but there's oftentimes a lot of people right at the entrance to the business where there's no traffic control device panhandling. Is that going to be prohibited?
Yes, if they're asking or soliciting those driving along the street. So the street is the same as a traffic control device. If you're soliciting from someone at a street, whether they're stopped or not, if they're anywhere along the street, it's a violation of the ordinance. There also is the prohibition from soliciting within 25 feet of an entrance of a business, which we could extend to 50, and that's what I was asking feedback on that one. But
I guess the question, there's a lot of people, they're coming out of the shopping center, so they're in a parking lot, they're not on the street. You see what I'm saying? The individual standing adjacent to the street, but they're standing in a parking lot, not on the cars are not on the street, they're in the parking lot.
Yeah, so if it's a parking lot on private property, if they have permission of the owner of that private property, we can't tell them what to do. But if they don't have the permission from the owner of that private property, then that is unlawful.
I'm very doubtful that they would have permission from a shopping center owner to have permission to solicit.
Right.
But how do you enforce that? Because you're going to ask them, do you have permission to solicit?
Because it would be a defense. They would have to show their permission. And generally, it's written permission. We can include written permission in there rather than just permission.
I think written permission would be a good addition.
Councilwoman Cantelmi.
Thank you, Mayor. Joe, can you walk us through real quick, hypothetically, if somebody were committing an aggressive panhandling incident, the police were called, what's the next step? Are they cited? Do they go to jail? Can you kind of walk us through the process?
Yeah, so aggressive solicitation is like all of our city ordinances that is capped out at misdemeanor level. So they can either get that misdemeanor through citation or sent to prosecution through a long form process. But either way, they're getting a summons to court and appearing through court. And so obviously everyone is innocent until proven guilty, including those in panhandling and aggressive solicitation. So it goes through the court like any other misdemeanor process at that point.
Just for the record, I would prefer the 50 feet too, because 25 feet is pretty much between you and me. 50 feet is probably way over there. I had a business downtown, a wedding business, and if you're walking towards somebody, that 25 feet gap gets eaten up very quickly. If you want to avert somebody, you have an opportunity to do it if you have a little bit more space between the two of those. The aggressive panhandling is a problem downtown after dark. It was something I had to deal with the whole time I owned my wedding business down there. And, you know, all the many, many years since the early 70s of just going to the courthouse at night. How do we fulfill the execution of these ordinances if it's on the courthouse? Would we call the sheriff's department since it's a county island, or do we have that interagency agreement still with the Prescott Police Department and we call them?
I'm looking at the chief to see if she wants to address it directly, but yes, it's within city limits, so our ordinances are enforceable. And in terms of interagency agreement, I guess chief can direct.
Hi, yes, that's a good question. So we do have an agreement in place with the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office where we police the outside and patrol the outside of the county. So the question I would ask about this particular ordinance, though, is because it's a county island there, what kind of agreement do we need to have in place for enforcement of a city code?
So
we can talk later too about that.
Yeah, we can talk about that later. But the answer is it's still within city limits. It may not be city property, it's owned by the county, but it doesn't exclude it from being within the city's jurisdiction.
Thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem Montoya.
Thank you, Mayor. Joe, I guess my question is, when the previous distance restrictions were put in place, was there a logic to that we're aware of, or was there a reason behind that? I mean, is there times when 25 feet makes more sense than 50 feet, or was it just arbitrarily designed? And I know that you weren't here when this was probably originally done, but I guess I'm just wondering if there's a logical reason for the distinction.
I'll not answer your question directly because I don't know the answer, but as all ordinances, it just has to have a rational basis. There has to be a reason. And so as we were looking at it, we tried to figure, what would be a distance that someone would be comfortable. And we also reviewed other ordinances throughout the state and throughout the country that have similar ordinances. And I'll tell you, the distances are all over the place. So it really comes down to a change from 25 to 50, for example, as long as we articulate why. And I think, for example, Councilwoman Cantalme just did, that there's this comfort level of being able to maneuver around it, then it's an enforceable, lawful decision. It just has to have a rational basis. I don't know what it was previously, but I think we just try to look at it in terms of what would be a comfort level.
So just to provide my feedback into the pile here, so I'll say that I'm fine with 50 feet to be uniform, because I think to Councilwoman Cantalme's point, 50 feet is a bigger buffer. It makes sense to me. And also, uniform makes it simpler to enforce in my mind. That's my thinking, is that if you're like, yep, you're closer than 50 feet, I think that's simple. And instead of being like, oh, well, in this instance, it's 25, this instance is 50, I just think simplifying it makes things easier. So that's my input.
Councilman Tenney.
Thank you, Mayor. I guess I would echo that exactly. We already ask our police officers to remember 3,000 things. There's no point in asking them to remember 3,001 things. 50 feet, I think it makes a lot of sense based on the input we've gotten from you, and I would recommend it be uniform as well at 50 feet.
Councilmember Rusing.
Thank you. I have another suggestion. Paragraph D talks about any commercial business or privately owned establishment, and I was wondering what you thought about if we added schools, public or private, or hospitals.
Yes, thank you, Councilmember. I actually added that in to this version that you see on the TV, and I know it wasn't in the previous version, but I think that it made a lot of sense and it is consistent with it. So I guess I would still seek direction from council, but I thought that was one that made a lot of sense.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or comments on the council? Any public comments?
We do have a few, Mayor, and literally just a few. Ralph Hess.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. I happened to be here when this revision version of the code provision was modified back in 2013. And the issue that was addressed at that time by Mr. Palladini was that when you're not dealing with aggressive panhandling, you have the issue of free speech. People have the right to ask you for money. And particularly with regard to subsection D, if I recall correctly, and I think I do, the reason that the original or the current version that states immediately adjacent to the entrance of a business in a manner interfering with ingress or egress to the business entrance was the reason that language was decided upon was because in the downtown area, every business is within 25 feet of each other. So basically, by requiring that anyone within 25 feet of the entrance or the exit of any commercial business in the downtown area along Whiskey Row or on Cortez, thank you. You're going to prohibit any type of wandering minstrel. You're going to be prohibiting any type of solicitation in that whole area. And at that time, the concern was that that would violate the wandering minstrel's freedom of speech. So if you require the 25-foot, or if you prohibit anyone from asking or soliciting, or anyone from Prescott, Prescott Center for the Arts, for being down there urging people to buy tickets to the next performance in front of the Palace Theater, or in front of the Palace Bar and Restaurant, you're prohibiting all that free speech. So that's my concern, and that's the one provision, and I haven't looked that closely at the others, and I might have similar concerns with those. So I'd ask you to consider that.
Mary Frederickson.
Good afternoon. Mary Frederickson, resident of Prescott. And I apologize if this is already addressed within the ordinance, which I have not read in full. But as far as aggressiveness goes, is that on an objective or a subjective basis? Is it a reasonable person, or the person being solicited, or the person doing the solicitation? Where's the standard?
Yeah, so, and I can go through it, Mayor, if you want, but basically it is, it's all clearly defined. So, and here are the ways that you can aggressively solicit, which is making any physical contact whatsoever, following someone after they've said no, continuing to ask after they've said no, approaching the person in a way that is intended or is likely to cause a reasonable person to fear bodily harm. So that's the reasonable standard that you brought up, or using obscene or abusive language. So that's the way that that's how we define aggressive.
Okay, great, because I'm just thinking of as I'm close to being a little old lady myself, I'm thinking of the little old lady, unsteady on her feet, walking down the sidewalk, and some young big guy coming up to her, maybe asking as politely, in his mind, she may feel threatened, since a slight touch will tumble her on the street. But it's a reasonable person?
It's a reasonable person standard if there's not touch in those other markers. If there's any touch at all, then that automatically qualifies as aggressive.
Thank you.
Councilman Shishka.
Thanks, Mayor. Hey, Joe.
So this whole thing is about aggressive.
This whole thing is about aggressive solicitation.
It's in the aggressive solicitation ordinance, but there are extended prohibited acts that may not meet the definition of aggressive in the ordinance, but falls within similar conduct, so it's also prohibited.
Okay. So could you define that a little closer for me?
Yeah, so it's any solicitation that's aggressive in aggressive manner, which is the kind of the 5 points that we just got into. And then it's also any solicitation from near a bank or an ATM, any solicitation that is from someone in a motor vehicle, And then, sorry, I'm just looking, any solicitation of someone who is engaging in a financial transaction. It's people in a more vulnerable state, and it's meant to protect those people who are in a more vulnerable state and also those people who could get themselves in danger, like soliciting from a moving vehicle.
Okay. So let me ask you this. So you're driving by, a guy has, he's within 25 or 25 feet of a business, and he has a sign that says, I'm homeless, can you, give me money? Is that solicitation?
That is solicitation under this draft. It would be a prohibited act of solicitation.
So how is this reported?
It would be the same as we kind of talked about in camping. It would be the same. Whereas if law enforcement was driving by and saw it, they could act, or it would be reported by any member of the public who witnessed criminal activity.
Okay, thank you.
So, Joe, that was my question too, whether it was a verbal solicitation or solicitation by sign or some other visual media.
Yeah, so, and I'm just going to read the definition. Sorry, that's kind of boring, but to request an immediate donation of money or other thing of value from another person, regardless of the solicitor's purpose or intended use of the money or other thing of value. The solicitation may be without limitation by the spoken, written, or printed word or by the other means of communication.
So if they put on their sign just, I need help, would that be considered a solicitation rather than saying, give me money?
I think if it said, I need help, it's probably not money or a thing of value. And I think it's worded the way it is, not necessarily for that situation, but more for someone who is protesting or someone who is advertising a church. So these things, I mean, we see at the courthouse, people advertise a church or religion. That would not fall into the definition because it's not asking for immediate donation of money or other thing of value.
All right, that makes sense. Councilmember Rusing.
Joe, I have a question. I've seen panhandlers on corners with infants, small children, minors. Is that another code somewhere that prevents that? Because I find that very disturbing when they use little kids.
Yeah, that would not be handled differently. Unless there was endangerment, for example, or it fell into other criminal statutes. It's not found otherwise in our ordinances. And certainly one thing we can consider.
So, Joe, what about Mr. Hess's comments about restricting free speech?
I think it is a concern. It's always a concern. And that is one reason that the word solicit is worded the way it is. So it doesn't lump into activity a bunch of speech that is otherwise protected. But even asking for money is protected. But these are meant to be rational, reasonable limitations on that. So I think it's a good point, and I think it's a concern we have to keep in mind. But I don't think it prohibits us from making any restrictions on solicitation.
And I think, Tyler, we still have the change for the better deposit mechanisms on the courthouse plaza, correct?
Yes, Mayor, that is correct. We currently have, I believe, 6 or 7 of those donation meters, boxes. People also donate online as well.
Yeah, it might be appropriate to kind of republicize those devices so that people who feel inclined to provide some financial support can be directed into those rather than doing it directly to the solicitor.
Absolutely, that's something that we can do.
Do we have another public comment?
We do have one more, Mayor. Louis Fruworth.
Good afternoon, Mayor, Council. I just wanted to back up some of the things you guys were asking. often frequent the businesses in and around Miller Valley, Hillside, Fair, Willow Creek, Iron Springs, Gale Gardner, and all the intersections and all the shopping centers. And I can't tell you how many times I've almost gotten in accidents, either because the person in front of me stopped their car suddenly to hand money out the window to somebody, or you are really distracted in your ability to drive when you're trying to either get into a parking lot or get out of a parking lot for businesses when someone's standing there throwing a sign in your face. So I do think adding on to with commercial businesses, the entry and egress to parking lots of commercial businesses is really important, because it does distract the drivers. It does cause the potential of accidents. And frankly, I have witnessed vans driving around, dropping them off, and then a few hours later driving around and picking them back up. So Change for the Good might have done very good for the downtown, but it's all moved to the north of town, and we are constantly being panhandled. I'd like to see that come to an end through this ordinance. So thank you, and I agree with the 50 feet as well.
That's all, Mayor.
Mayor?
Okay, Joe, I think you have
Mayor?
direction here.
Mayor, I have a comment.
Councilmember Rusing.
Thank you. I would like to ask for some signage, like at the outskirts of town. I've seen other communities where they'll have a sign referring to their camping ordinance section, blah, 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 and solicitation ordinance will be enforced, just to give people a heads up when they come into town that there's a few ordinances that will be enforced and that they need to follow. Thank you.
So other than that, I think we have a pretty good consensus here as far as the distance agreement to have that uniform, and that certainly helps our law enforcement personnel to be able to know that they've got one distance to work with. And I think really it addresses almost all of the concerns that I know I have and other members of the council have. And it really, I think, will make the downtown business district and our tourists and the people that visit here a little more appreciative of not having this type of solicitation constantly being, I don't know, connected with their travels around the courthouse plaza. All right, if there's nothing else, Councilman Shish, could you have a last question? All right, this study session is adjourned.